Nor did he discourage his son from writing poems, though he did warn sensibly enough that Kingsley could not expect to make a living at any kind of writing. In the early 1930s, as the slump intensified, Kingsley became aware that his father was disturbed at the prospect of losing his job. Later, too, when Coleman's merged with Reckitt's, there was a danger that if he was not fired, William would be shifted to Reckitt's headquarters in Norwich. Luckily, both disasters were avoided. William suffered nothing worse than having his office moved from the city to Bedford Square in Bloomsbury. He even prospered. The annual summer holiday taken at Pevensey in Sussex and later East Runton in Norfolk, in a cottage or digs, increased from 2 weeks to 3. The Amyses moved house twice from Buckingham Gardens to Edna Road and later to Galpins Road, though they did not move far. All 3 homes were in Norbury, all within walking distance of each other. Each was slightly larger than the last, representing one small step up the social ladder, but none was significantly grander than the others, and all conformed to the same basic pattern. Downstairs, drawing room, dining room, and kitchen. On the floor above, 2 double bedrooms and a box room, and above that an attic, used for storage only. The style in which the rooms were furnished was spare and practical, like the rooms Peter Furneaux was used to, which had in them 2 kinds of objects, ones you used, like chairs, and ones you looked at, like his mother's china cats. Drawing room and dining room were rather grand names for what were in fact rather small rooms, separated by thin walls. Such physical circumstances made it difficult for Kingsley to find much privacy, even if his parents encouraged it, which they did not. His father's constant concern was to stop Kingsley getting away from him. Reading in public was deemed rude, while reading in private was antisocial. Kingsley was supposed to join in the family circle, not escape into solitude. What Peter Furneaux, an only child too, felt about his family reflects closely what Kingsley felt about his. Peter is envious of Daphne, a young neighbour, of her having a brother and a sister, of what he imagined the life of the whole family to be like. Being an only child did not mean that you were by yourself too much. On the contrary, you got the whole of your parents reserved for just you instead of divided up into 3, say. Peter liked his father, but would prefer on the whole to have him as an uncle, even one living in the same house. His mother he quite loved, but there again she talked to him about quite a lot of things he could not remember afterwards, even the next minute. Robin Davies, in You Can't Do Both, has some of the same feelings. In his teens, he is effectively an only child, like Peter and Kingsley, because his older brother and sister have left home. Far from feeling unwanted, as a kind of afterthought to the family, he is the youngest by 7 years, Robin feels the opposite and thinks longingly about what it must be like really to be unwanted, a condition he thinks he could willingly put up with 6 days out of every 7, leaving only Sundays for him to be wanted on. Like his fictional creations, Peter and Robin, Kingsley found the domestic atmosphere in which he lived claustrophobic, constricting. He could have settled for less love. His parents added to his isolation within their close little circle by ruthlessly restricting his choice of friends and his opportunities to meet them. They could not have done these more unflaggingly if there had been a long family history of male prostitution or juvenile dipsomania, Kingsley recalled in his memoirs. One of their reasons may simply have been the desire to keep their only child to themselves. But they also wanted to make sure that Kingsley did not fall into the wrong, that is, into lower-class company. When Robin Davies' father bans him from having tea with his school-chum Wade, Robin wonders why. Does he think Wade is a bad influence? A smoker, drinker, and gambler, perhaps even a sex pervert? But it is simpler than that. Mr. Davies thinks Wade looks a bit of a hobbledehoy, and sounds even more of one over the telephone. For Mr. Davies, as for William Ames, even a hint of hobbledehoyness in his son's friends sets alarm bells frantically ringing, and he expects his son to accept that hint as sufficient reason for barring all contact out of school. The fear of falling from social grace had passed from William's parents to William, and he expected his own son to keep to the same strict social rules. Kingsley might boil with frustration, but there was no point in turning to his mother for help. There was nothing she could do, even if she wanted to. 2 incidents in Kingsley's life before he reached adolescence were to leave lasting marks. One was his first flight on an aeroplane, taken in 1932 when he was 10. It was a 5-bob, 25p, flip around Croydon Aerodrome, then London's major airport, which he made with 3 or 4 friends in a de Havilland Dragon Rapide. whose tapering wings and wheels with spats Kingsley always afterwards remembered. Flying was a novelty at the time, not the routine means of transport it has since become, and this flip was supposed to be a treat. That, though, was not what it turned out to be. Looking through the window beside him, Kingsley suddenly saw the ground beyond his shoulder. This was the wrong place for it. The ground was supposed to be under your feet. The shock put Kingsley off flying for the rest of his life. He was tempted, but in the next 6 decades he never flew again. It became a matter of some regret that this inhibited his chances of travelling. If he had been willing to fly, he could have visited, say, America more often. However, balancing such missed opportunities against the horror of finding the ground where it ought not to be, Kingsley never felt he had made the wrong decision. The other experience, with lasting consequences, was cumulative rather than a single incident. When his parents went out at night, as they often did, even by the time Kingsley was old enough to be left on his own, they sometimes got a babysitter, but if he told them he could manage without one, they did not. Yet, alone in the house, Kingsley felt abandoned. Perhaps someone would climb through the window and murder him. Sometimes he screamed. Throughout his life, Kingsley was to be afflicted by anxieties of all kinds. His horrified reaction to flying and to being left alone were the first signs. The fees at the City of London School were low, £30 a term, but would have consumed close to a fifth of the income of someone on a salary as modest as William Amos's, £500 or so a year. In September 1934, aged 12, Kingsley proceeded there from Norbury College all the same. William gambled that his son would get a scholarship in time for his second year, and the gamble paid off. Kingsley was to boast ungratefully for a time that he had been a scholarship boy from the start, but he was not, and he acknowledged, to himself at least, that it was no small risk his father had taken in making a commitment to pay at least 1 year's school fees. For if Kingsley had failed to win a scholarship, his father would have been faced with either the humiliation of withdrawing his son, or the burden of paying £90 a year for 7 years. The City of London School stood at that time on the Victoria Embankment, just inside the city's western boundary near Blackfriars, hence the name of Peter Furneaux's school, Blackfriars Grammar. The site had been occupied since the Great Fire of London, successively by a theatre and the offices of the New River Company and the City Gas Works. In 1883 the school had transferred there from elsewhere in the city to new premises, purpose-built in Renaissance style, mainly of Portland stone and brick, which Kingsley found on first arrival rather oppressively dignified, with lots of corridors and a vast agoraphobic playground filled with self-possessed boys in black coats and striped trousers. The school has now moved again to a site along the riverfront east of Blackfriars, but the buildings Kingsley knew remain. In the 1990s, guides conducting boat trips down the Thames are apt to point them out as having once housed the school Winston Churchill went to before going on to Harrow. This sets the tourists goggling, but it is not true. The school can boast another Prime Minister among its old boys, however, Herbert Asquith, Earl of Oxford. The City of London School is a relatively modern foundation, though it has ancient origins. A town clerk of the city called John Carpenter, also the executor of Dick Whittington's will and a member of Parliament, left money when he died in 1442 for the education of 4 poor boys. His bequest was, after several centuries, protracted politicking in the city and an Act of Parliament, eventually incorporated into the funds that were used to launch the school in 1837. This was a time when progressive educators in London were challenging the monopolies of Oxford and Cambridge, where tests of Anglican orthodoxy still governed admissions. In a spirit of rebellion, 2 colleges were founded, University College and King's College, now parts of London University, which in turn opened their own schools. Religion was taught in these establishments, but it was not a condition of entry to any of them to be a subscribing Anglican. Nor was it at the City of London School, the Act of Parliament by which it was founded laying no religious restrictions of any kind on masters or boys. The result was a liberal tradition that endured to Amos's day and beyond. Catholics, Free Churchmen and Jews were pupils from the start. Low fees and scholarships for boys from London County Council and Middlesex primary schools ensured a wide social as well as religious mix. Kingsley was immediately sensitive to this spread of backgrounds, hearing accents both posh and common, varying from ones that discomforted me to ones that made me feel superior. But he also learned something more important. Watching how the other boys behaved, he realized that class did not count, here at least. whatever might be the case at other schools or in the wider world. Neither did religious difference. After announcements at morning assembly, but before prayers, the head nodded, as always, to the senior Jewish boy, who led from the hall the others of his faith, the Roman Catholics and the dissenters. This was how Kingsley remembered the school's spirit of tolerance, in the version of it he described in You Can't Do Both. He himself, though not a believer, stayed on for prayers. From all his years at the school, he could remember only one anti-Semitic incident. On parade, with the officer training corps, he was standing in the front rank alongside his friend Leonard Richenberg, when the regimental sergeant major attached to the school's corps from the regular army stopped in front of Richenberg and asked his name, which he knew perfectly well. The sergeant major's second question was, "What's your religion?" To which Richenberg replied, "Jewish, sir." Something like an audible hush fell on the parade, Kingsley wrote in his memoirs, as if every Gentile in hearing turned white. No training in good race relations had been necessary to produce this reaction. Tolerance was part of the climate. The author of the school's history, A.E. Douglas Smith, felt able to write in 1937 that the anti-Semitism of fascist countries is incomprehensible to boys who have made their life's friendships in the school. Kingsley himself wrote, "Nobody at the school had told me not to behave in the sort of way the sergeant major had. I just knew, like everyone else." Such attitudes to race and class stayed with Kingsley all his life. His later brand of right-wing conservatism did not include race or class prejudice, and the unreconstructed white racism which he found in the American South in the late 1960s was to make him deeply uncomfortable during the 4 months he spent teaching at Vanderbilt University in Tennessee, as he described at length in his memoirs. Kingsley might have turned out differently, might have become like his own Stanley Duke in Stanley and the Women, who admits to making the kind of mildly anti-Semitic remarks that came naturally to someone like me, born where and when I was, which is roughly when and where Kingsley was born. The City of London School steered him away from such attitudes. That did not stop him relishing and enjoying differences of class and race, a very different matter. He could always laugh at a joke about an Englishman, a Scotsman, and a Jew, or about an earl and a dustman, so long as it was a good one. But his enjoyment came from the comic possibilities of the differences between them. He could not find funny a joke based on the stereotypical notion that Jews or earls were funny or ridiculous, let alone contemptible just for being who they were. The social manners of the school were thus, by the standards of the time, tolerant, liberal, easy-going, but the school also kept a traditional framework of formality. Boys called masters sir, masters called boys by their surnames, and boys addressed each other in the same way, unless good friends. Canings were administered by both masters and prefects, a maximum of 6 strokes on the backside. Masters, though, were easily accessible. A boy with a problem had only to put his head round the door of their common room to have one come outside and discuss it. There was even an element of democracy in the school's administration, with a boys' representative assembly, whose resolutions were submitted to the headmaster for approval, and usually endorsed by him. One such resolution, passed the year after Kingsley arrived, called for the universal adoption of the uniform dress of black coat and striped trousers, the sight of which had helped so to intimidate him on his first morning. Strange, we might think, that boys should vote to impose such a funereal costume on themselves, but so they did, though in summer they sported the less sombre rig of blazer and boater. The headmaster appointed 3 years before Amos's arrival, F.R. Dale, had made a number of reforms, among them the introduction of streaming. This involved allocating the cleverer boys in each year to an A form, the less clever to a B. According to the school history, this system was intended to let the cleverer pupils develop quickly, while not depressing the less advanced with over-strong competition. It was thought to be a progressive innovation at the time, and would now be thought exactly the opposite. Nor did such naked intellectual segregation stop at the shuffling of boys into A and B packs. A master might make no bones about further discriminating between the bright and the dim, even within a class that had already been streamed. C.N. Biff Fokins, who taught in Kingsley's time, remembers how one of his colleagues, the Reverend C.J. Ellingham, approached his A-streamers. Ellingham handled every class with vigor and originality. In translation from the classics, for example, he had greyhounds and tortoises. He spent only half an hour of each lesson on the routine of translation. A tortoise started, but was allowed only limited time. "Right, now we'll have a greyhound. Off you go, Amos. And you tortoises, be ready with your pens and notebooks." The method suited Amos, and he forged ahead. Kingsley confirms that this teaching strategy was employed, though remembers Ellingham's terminology of discrimination as greyhounds and duds, not tortoises, surely even more crushing to the less bright, and whether tortoise or dud, certain to cause riotous protest in a classroom of the 1990s. Teaching was divided vertically as well as horizontally by subject matter as well as by ability. Boys could opt for one of three sides: classical, modern, or science, and there were A and B streams in each. An A streamer in the classical side would learn Greek and Latin, while a B streamer learned only Latin together with some extra science. The modern side learned modern languages, French and German or Spanish, with Latin thrown in, while the science side did physics, chemistry, and biology. The school was also divided in yet another way into houses, though this was done almost entirely to promote competition in sport. Kingsley's house was Hale. The curriculum was, however, not so rigidly structured as all this might suggest. All boys learned at least some science, and could specialize in history, maths, or economics by the time they reached the sixth form. Classics, though, were still the fashionable subject, as they had been in English education for decades, indeed centuries. One reason for their survival, besides the commonly held view that classics helped produce the best sort of English all-rounder, was the large number of classics scholarships that had accumulated over the years at Oxford and Cambridge, naturally a tempting target to boys of modest background. Another may have been that the headmaster, Dale, was himself a classicist, thus setting the school an example from the top. Kingsley remembers him as a scholar in the best old style. In his memoirs he wrote, "To hear him read Greek verse, observing tonic accent, metrical ictus, and the run of the meaning all at once, was to be given a distant view of some ideal beauty, as well as to marvel at a virtuoso. He was human, too. If ever a kind of man vanished for good, his did." Dale was evidently a remarkable person. Kingsley held him in terrified veneration. He was variously described as tall and dignified, friendly but austere. At Cambridge he had taken a double first in classics, and during the First World War won the DSO and the MC, becoming second in command of a battalion of the Royal Welsh Fusiliers. His war experience gave him perfect sympathy with ordinary people, according to one of Kingsley's contemporaries, who adds that Dale dominated the school. Another contemporary goes further and says Dale was worshipped. The school history, in the manner of school histories, finds it difficult to decide whether Dale was more the Roman for his unresting sense of duty, or more the Greek for his Sophoclean harmony and serenity of outlook. The boy who was captain of the school on Dale's arrival, T.B. Williamson, summed up his impact more pithily. Here was a man, we felt, who would stand no nonsense. Within a few months we had revised our opinion on this point. Under this head, there would be little, if any, nonsense to stand. Whatever his exact combination of qualities, now difficult to recapture from the awed memoirs of his pupils and the respectful official record, Dale clearly played an important part in creating a school which is remembered with an uncommon combination of real pleasure and genuine gratitude by its old boys 50 years on. Kingsley signed up with the classical side at first, but later began to question it with his friend Richenberg. They recognized that it was a good education in its way, but what was the point of it? Nobody explained. It was simply taken for granted that classics were best, except among those who had decided for themselves that science or languages were better. Richenberg hankered to switch to maths, though he stayed with classics. Kingsley began to hanker after English, but there was no English class for him to join. Eventually one was created, and he became its first pupil. It was the influence of Ellingham that did most to draw Amos towards English literature. After the uncertain leads in that direction given by Miss Barr and Mr. Ashley, Ellingham was also a remarkable man, the best teacher I have ever met, Richenberg remembers. In his enthusiasm for high standards, Ellingham wrote a book for 13 to 16-year-olds called Essay Writing, Bad and Good. It begins by saying that to write a good essay requires a good English style, which is hard to acquire. For bad style is catching, and we are surrounded by examples of it. 100 pages of lucid and robust advice follow, under headings like conciseness, vigor, the sentence, the paragraph. The book finishes with a blunt warning. While some people may be clever enough to write tour de force, proving that matricide is a virtue and chronic drunkenness the height of bliss, it is unlikely that you are one of them. From which it is not difficult to deduce that Ellingham would have thought little of the late 20th century notion that young people are full of innate creativity, just waiting to be poured out onto the page, if only it is not stifled by tedious lessons in grammar and construction. But Ellingham was no mere pedant. The school history describes him as imaginative and unconventional. His habit of letting greyhounds set the pace in class was part of his strategy for creating time for things that were not on the syllabus. He thought the 2 years' work which went into preparation for the school certificate exam could be done in 1 year, so leaving half the available time for other interests. He brought a gramophone into the classroom to introduce the boys to classical music and taught them about painting from a National Gallery catalogue. It was from him that Kingsley first learned about Picasso, Braque, and Matisse, those horrible people, as he would later describe them. His interest in music was further developed after school hours in the appreciation classes given by the music master, Mr. Taylor, who explained Brahms' First Symphony alternately on the blackboard and the piano, and did it so well that it remained the piece of its kind Kingsley understood best for the rest of his life. Kingsley continued his education outside the classroom, as he had begun to do at Norbury College. From other boys he now learned about a new diversity of possible interests: Fats Waller, Charles Morgan, air pistols, dating girls, Borodin, Rimsky-Korsakov, and from H.G. Williams Ashman he learned something of upper-middle-class life as represented by the possessions of actual pictures, not reproductions by living artists, the voluntary reading of the Oxford Book of French Verse, and the notion of foreign travel. He began too to discover literature for himself, notably the writers G.K. Chesterton and A.E. Housman, the first 2 grown-up writers I ever read outside school, he was later to recall. Chesterton's The Man Who Was Thursday became a particular favourite. Kingsley read it so many times he claimed that, if shown one sentence, he could quote the next from memory. Housman was the modern poet he came to like best of all, topping the list of his 20th century favourites: John Betjeman, W.H. Auden, Philip Larkin, Wilfred Owen, and Robert Graves. One day Mr. Ellingham revealed that Housman was his favourite poet too. This was important as confirmation of Amos's own judgment, but it was something more. Mr. Ellingham was a convinced Christian, while Housman was an atheist. So poetry was a form of truth, even if it did not tell the whole truth, and it was possible to admire poets with whose beliefs one did not agree. I saw forever that a poem is not a statement, and the poet affirmeth nothing, Amos wrote in his memoirs. 3. Evacuation to Marlborough. As Kingsley grew up, he began to talk back to his father. The family's hard cop found the suspect standing up for himself. The soft cop, Peggy, was not much involved, except when required to smooth things over. This was a contest between males, a joust between father, settled in his ideas, and son, groping to discover what his ideas were. The result was a violent quarrel, at least every week or 2 for years. There was no shortage of issues for the 2 to fight over. One was politics. As the 1930s drew on, Kingsley found they had made a socialist of him. Indeed, like many bright youngsters of the time, a supporter of communism and of Stalin. He was sometimes pious, though not humorless or single-minded about his beliefs. These were vague, based on his reading of writers like Auden and Orwell, rather than on first-hand acquaintance with social evils, of which in Norbury there were few conspicuous examples. Kingsley was against capitalism, rather than in favour of any very precise alternative. William Amos, the city man, was of course all for capitalism. He had been a Lloyd George liberal, after the First World War switching his allegiance to the Conservatives and becoming active in the party and the local Ratepayers Association. In retrospect, Kingsley came to cringe at the ease with which he was then willing to swallow beliefs, like the one contained in the question and answer, what would happen if somebody voted against Stalin, but who would ever want to? Swallow them he did, though, and such attitudes could hardly have been more contrary to his father's. This, of course, was a large part of the reason why Kingsley held them, though he did not realize that at the time. His beliefs seemed solid and convincing when he argued them, and it did not occur to him that it might be his father he was struggling against more than it was capitalism. Art, broadly defined, was another fruitful source of dispute between father and son. William's tastes were middle to lowbrow. He enjoyed now-forgotten detective story writers like Freeman Willis Croft, R. Austin Freeman, H.C. Bailey, and Francis Grierson, the masculine equivalents of Peggy's feminine romances. The theatre to William meant West End successes, especially musical comedies, while in music his preference was for Gilbert and Sullivan and Edwardian ballads, with, as Kingsley remembers them, mostly one-word titles like Because and Until. William took Kingsley to see The Pirates of Penzance and The Yeoman of the Guard, but they only bored his son, who meanly exaggerated his boredom to discomfort his father. Kingsley preferred promenade concerts at the Queen's Hall, or John Gielgud playing Hamlet at the Streatham Hill Theatre. Ballads were sung at the piano during musical evenings when William and Peggy entertained their friends, but why, Kingsley would caustically wonder, was there no Schubert or Wolf among the sheet music beneath the lid of the piano stool? He would make this deficiency an excuse to accuse his father of not really liking music, which was untrue. William did like music, only not Kingsley's sort. And he had a swift comeback to his son's disdain, to the effect that attitudes like Kingsley's would come better from someone who could actually play what he liked on the piano, as he could, and Kingsley could not. There was no easy answer to that, in fact no answer at all. It was one of Kingsley's lifelong regrets that his father, willing enough to boss his son around in other courses, failed to bully him into learning the piano. Musical evenings were a dying form of family entertainment, as Kingsley was aware. The wireless and the gramophone were replacing them. Battle was therefore joined over control of the switch on the wireless set and the needle on the record. Kingsley might wish to hear, say, Brahms' Second Symphony, when it got one of its rare performances on the sparse radio music programs of the period, but his father, after a day at the office and a long journey home, would not want to hear Brahms blaring through the house all the hours there were and upsetting his wife. It was bad enough, in William's view, for Kingsley to waste his own time over books or art galleries, but far worse when he wanted to waste other people's time by flooding the whole house with music. It wasn't just Brahms that William anathematized. My father's Catholic distaste ranged from Haydn to Troyes and his Mandoliers, from Benny Goodman to Borodin, Kingsley wrote in his memoirs. But his father had the last word. The growling mood of low-intensity domestic conflict is captured in this passage from the Riverside Villas murder. Having come downstairs after doing his homework, Peter Furneaux ate supper, liver and bacon and cold apple pie, with his parents, and then he was allowed to listen, for a time, to Romance in Rhythm with Geraldo and his orchestra, not his gaucho tango orchestra, just his orchestra, and featuring Olive Groves and the romantic young ladies, so that when objection to all that nigger ragtime stuff was voiced, Peter noted the phrase to pass on to a friend, and instantly switched off. First round to father. The period details, incidentally, are accurate. Kingsley put in more research on what had been going on in his own youth than he had done for any previous novel, reading through a month's back numbers of the Times, Punch, and the Radio Times to get his facts straight. But Peter comes back fighting. Having consulted the Radio Times, he suggests they switch on later and listen to the BBC Orchestra Section G conducted by Leslie Heward, and with Heddle Nash, tenor, performing stuff called things like K205. This puts Captain Furneaux on the spot. He can hardly admit that the reason he doesn't want to listen to this obviously worthy music is that he doesn't like it, any more than he doesn't like the more obviously unworthy nigger ragtime. He therefore switches the argument to, it was getting late and there was school in the morning. This is pretty lame stuff, and Peter senses that he is ahead, making this the perfect moment for asking permission to have a bath, since refusal could only look like retaliation, which could only look like acknowledgement of having taken a knock. Permission is granted, so Peter has won the bout. He is pleased about this, although it does occur to him wearily to wonder if everybody who lived with anybody kept carrying on in that sort of way. It was as though the Marxist version of class war and endless crisis was being played out in miniature between Kingsley, the proletariat, and William, the ruling class, on a daily basis. Like Peter Furneaux, Kingsley used his growing intellectual interests as evidence of superiority over his father, and as useful weapons to deploy in generational skirmishing. But at least in rows over politics or art, he could say exactly what he wanted without fear of anything worse than being argued back at. Sex was a different matter. Here, intellectual airs and superior attitudes were no help to Kingsley at all. Sex was never willingly discussed or referred to in the Amis household. Kingsley was given no instruction in the basic facts of the matter by either parent. By the age of 7 or thereabouts, he had picked up a rough working knowledge with plenty of omissions and guesswork, from his schoolmates, who had presumably picked up what they knew in the same way, through the tribal network that tells children things about the adult world their elders are reluctant, for whatever reason, to pass on. The playground, rather than themselves, seems to have been the source from which parents of the time took it for granted that children would learn the facts of life. Some 10 years after Kingsley had pieced the fundamentals together, his mother remarked that she supposed he knew all there was to know about marriage and so on, without thinking it necessary to ask how he had found out. Kingsley replied that he thought he did know, forbearing on his side to add that she could have made his life a good deal easier if she had explained it all to him years earlier. But this would have been too much to hope for from parents for whom sex was too embarrassing to be mentioned even obliquely in the presence of their son. Kingsley remembers his mother silencing the woman next door with a warning headshake when she dared to mention in front of them both something as sexually unalarming as it is possible to imagine, like the fact of somebody going on their honeymoon. Standard middle-class reticence aside, it may be that William and Peggy had their own reasons for silence. Perhaps Kingsley's painful birth put an end to their sex lives, out of fear that Peggy would have to go through it all again. But this is speculation. The only thing about his parents' attitude to sex that Kingsley ever knew for sure was their unwillingness to talk about it in his presence. It was not his parents' failure to tell him the basic facts Kingsley minded. He was content at having picked these up in the casual way he did. It was their refusal to acknowledge that sex existed at all. What he missed from his parents, and what he made sure to give his own 2 sons when their time came, was not the information that would have been revealed in a frank talk about sex. He knew enough about that already, as he was correctly to assume his sons did later, but the permit such a sex talk would have given him to acknowledge the sexual world's existence. Why go around carrying one's sexual awareness like a guilty secret when everyone shared the same knowledge and feelings? In no sphere is it truer that it is necessary to say what it is unnecessary to say, was how he put the case for candour in his memoirs. Robin Davies suffers the same frustration in You Can't Do Both. His mother and father discuss the impending birth of his sister's first child in what they take to be a series of impenetrable exchanges between them, but which Robin understands perfectly well. Why must he behave like a prodigy of ignorance and a monster of incuriosity, he wonders. His parents should treat him like an average boy of nearly 15, or they should refrain from all mention of the subject. He wants to bawl at them, a demand to be told what the hell was being talked about. But he refrains, knowing that his father would only tell him to be a good chap and not poke his nose into matters which were none of his business. And then it might embarrass his mother. Sensing what his son may be thinking, Mr. Davies changes the subject. "Have you done your bigs this morning?" So Robin is put in his place by being reminded of his only just out of nappies status. If sex in general was a threat, it was masturbation, not girls, that boys needed to be protected from, at least at the start of their adolescence. Fears about what this could do to a growing lad's health and sanity had declined since the high Victorian years when experts could claim it led to blindness and other extremes of debility, but fears were still strong. A friend of Kingsley's was told of a mythical being who was warned in apparent seriousness that if he kept on masturbating his thigh would eventually snap like a rotten stick. Kingsley began to masturbate when he was 14, and was insufficiently vigilant to prevent his father finding out what he was up to. His father harangued him along the lines of how this hateful practice was a danger to his general health, warned him he would go balmy if he carried on, and urged him to stop before it was too late. Somewhat ashamed at this onslaught, in which his mother joined, Kingsley duly promised, though with undeclared reservations. He thought it was just like his father to be horrified by what everybody else took for granted. But to appease him, he would enter into a sort of bargain. Admit a little, and be forgiven the rest on the promise of not doing it again, then be careful. Thereafter, Kingsley wrote, I went my own way under a pact of silence and dissimulation. William kept a watchful eye on his son's behaviour, and now and then repeated his warnings. A sort of hide-and-seek or low-key witch hunt followed, the atmosphere of which is evoked by Peter Furneaux's experience. As part of his undeclared, unremitting, and quite unavailing war on Peter's baser nature, Captain Furneaux had decreed that he should never lock the bathroom door, in case somebody wanted something. The shaving mirror? The soap rack? And had been known to come stealing upstairs at times like this to check that his wish was observed. On one occasion, determined on a session of self-abuse, Peter gets ready to lock the door, not spin things out too long, and be prepared, should his father show a sudden desire to carry off the tooth-glass, to plead thoughtlessness, habit, sieve-like memory. Kingsley, too, was not supposed to lock the door when he had a bath, but his father did not pursue him with quite the missionary or police-state zeal of Captain Furneaux. Kingsley sensed that he was genuinely shy about sex and would prefer not to have to deal with it at all. William had done what his conscience told him to do by delivering the required warning against self-abuse, but having done his own duty, he was largely content to leave Kingsley to do his, at any rate so long as nothing awkward or unpleasant came to light. Unlike Peter Furneaux, Kingsley never went so far as mutual masturbation with other boys. Nor did he take the further step into sexual experience that the plot of the Riverside Villas murder required Peter to take. Peter loses his virginity when he is seduced by the much older wife of a neighbour. Real life was not so kind to Kingsley, who had to wait several more years for his first chance to make love to a real woman. In sexual matters, William Amis not only towed the standard middle-class line, he made it his own deeply felt personal attitude too. But in matters of religion, he was much more his own man. He attended the occasional church service at Christmas or on Armistice Day, but he discarded his own Baptist upbringing, which Kingsley describes as a fairly grueling, nonconformist nurture, and completely rejected the system of beliefs that the services he went to celebrated. In this he regarded himself as an apostate, an emancipator, even a rebel, which Kingsley thought laughable at the time, since he could not bring himself to see his father as any sort of rebel against anything. The consequence for Kingsley, in one respect at least, was the same in religion as sex, though the intention was utterly different. He received no instruction from his father in either subject. If William was altogether silent about sex, silent even about why he was silent, he was more forthcoming about religion. He resolved that the chapel stuff he had had to put up with when he was a boy would not be rammed down Kingsley's throat. Whether or not Kingsley took his cue from his father, he never felt the slightest temptation to believe in the central Christian idea, the existence of God. He came to endorse the proposition that the traditional God of Christianity is very wicked, and wrote that he had no belief in God, not the first beginning of one, not a shred, and never have had as far back as I can remember. Not no belief in him as all-wise, all-loving, all-powerful, difficult as these might be to acquire, just no belief in him as an eternal supreme being. Apart from a few vaguely remembered moments of doubt when he was around the age of 11, Kingsley never deviated from this utter rejection. Though aspects of Christianity and of Christ continuously attracted him, the first necessary step in belief, faith in God, he came to think of as a gift, and one he did not have. This did not remove him from the influence of the religion he could not accept. There were daily prayers at school, and a weekly scripture lesson, in which subject he even got a credit in his school certificate, though less through study than through the luck of happening to read some notes about the authorship of the St. James Epistle on the morning of the exam, which then turned up on the question paper. He studied the Greek Testament in the sixth form, and joined the school chapel choir. In the army he went to Church of England services, and then, of course, there was English literature. From beginning to end, English poetry as a whole has been shaped by religion, constantly reflects it, looks back to it often when it seems furthest away, as he later wrote. Kingsley studied scripture because he had no choice, joined the school's chapel choir because of the singing, and attended services in the army because it was the easy option. But one way or another he absorbed a great deal of Christian lore, and acquired much respect and affection for it. When he came to reread the Gospels after more than 20 years, he was surprised at how much he still recognized, and recognized with some intimacy. Later still, he could describe himself as an unwilling believer, and wrote a novel, Russian Hide-and-Seek, 1980, about the pitiful plight of an England in which both art and religion had been obliterated by a Russian communist takeover. He even became a stout defender of the traditional English church against what he saw as the depredations of its modernizers, declaring himself to have much more in common with a believer of my own generation than either of us shares with the modern Christian. If he had only been able to accept God, it is possible to imagine him a thoroughgoing Christian, cranky, anti-modern, and opinionated, no doubt, but devout in his own way too. Christianity not only haunted Kingsley's imagination, it percolated through into his character by way of his father. William may have thought he had got rid of all the baggage of religion when he stopped believing in it, but traces remained all the same. He objected to the use of Christ as a swear word, and would even so far forget himself as to put the blame for Kingsley's misdeeds down to his son's lack of religion. This was something that was to puzzle Robin Davies in You Can't Do Both. His father, like Kingsley's, had been inculcated with a lot of mumbo-jumbo stuff in his childhood, and is all against inculcating Robin with the same. Then why, wonders Robin, when he's really fed up with me, why does he tell me the trouble with me is I've got no religion? It was in his morals, though, that William's Christian upbringing most truly survived. Conscientiousness, patience, frugality, as Kingsley listed them, the morals of a pious Protestant. And insofar as Kingsley felt able to claim such virtues as honesty, responsibility, thrift, and industry for himself, he believed he would have less claim to them if he had been brought up quite outside the shadow of the chapel. Meanwhile, Kingsley tried his hand at writing poetry. One of his early efforts was a description of the journey to the City of London school playing field at Grove Park, written in imitation of Chaucer's prologue. It was so good, says the master for whom Kingsley wrote it, J.E.B. Boggy Marsh, that I kept it, but it disappeared in the confusion of 1939. Later pieces were published in the school magazine. The first of these was called Prelude. Thus I set out, it begins, and thus I return, it finishes. In 58 unrhymed lines, it describes the passage of a year and the stirring of vague adolescent moods and longings. As for happiness, what is happiness? I am too young to know. Kingsley later described it as a kind of suburbanite's wasteland, tizzied up with bits of wild. More pieces followed, with the mature Amys judged to be of appalling pretentiousness and affectation. One was called Prometheus, after the mythological figure who stole fire to restore it to the human race, and deals in fantastic images, such as of the world becoming a roaring holocaust, and I alone, untouched, stood gazing as if turned to stone, for in that furnace was eternity, and God threw back its doors that night for me. Next came a prose poem, He Curses His Insensibility, which drew Mr. Ellingham's proper contempt. Shadows, trees, sky, this is the holier trinity, but its divine power fails to transfigure a reluctant heart, and in vain the wind of love fans the cheek of the libertine. The last to be published in the school magazine was He Reads Immortality in the Eyes of a Virgin. Be sure now, my soul, that this is the moment for which you pine, this the split second which you have ever desired to fashion into eternity. Treasure this when all else has no worth. This is your one happiness before death. This is the hour of your birth. Not much sign in these of blooming literary talent, rather of adolescence trying to express itself in borrowed, ill-digested forms. But it was not until after he left school, and other influences had time to make themselves felt, that Kingsley began to find his feet as a poet. He became one of the school magazine's 3 editors, and contributed reports on the proceedings of the school parliament. The Easter edition of 1941 covers 3 of the Parliament's sessions and catches Kingsley in the act of moving politically leftwards. In the first session, we find him playing the moderate part of deputy leader of the Labour opposition, but by the 3rd session he has become the only communist in the House. In which guise he wrote of himself, he rose and fiercely attacked the government with a speech of which 3/4 was unacknowledged quotation from Lenin. He might have become a communist, but in reporting his own plagiarism, Kingsley showed he had not lost his sense of humour in the process. By then the Second World War was well underway. The coming of war made Kingsley more politically aware than ever before, and opened up a new phase in his school life. Although he had been sufficiently conscious of international tensions to join the school branch of the League of Nations Union, and to attend some of the meetings it held jointly with the City of London Girls' School, girls of course being an extra incentive, the outbreak of hostilities still came to him as a great surprise. The school authorities had been more alert to the dangers of the times. They had first thought up a scheme of evacuation to Wales, but abandoned it in preference to a deal with Marlborough School in Wiltshire, struck in 1938, a year ahead of need. Under this arrangement, the City of London school was to share kitchens, dining room, classrooms, and sports fields with Marlborough. But Marlborough could not offer spare beds, so the City of London boys were to be billeted in whatever accommodation could be found nearby. In the last days of August 1939, boys and masters carried suitcases to school and bought daily train tickets, not daring to buy new season tickets in case they did not return home that night. Labels were issued, and the school paraded in columns to rehearse the older pupils in not marching so fast that they left the younger ones behind. Gas mask drills were held, and boys persuaded to give up large suitcases for smaller ones. Gas mask drills were held, and boys persuaded to give up large suitcases for small ones. Eventually, on Friday 1st of September, 2 days before war was declared, the column of boys and masters marched the few hundred yards from the school's front steps to Blackfriars Station, where normal train services were alternating with fast specials carrying schoolchildren out of East London. At 12:30, the school started across the city to Ealing, where a special train from Marlborough was expected. But the only train at the station was a Taunton express, into which zealous evacuation officials proceeded to herd the rear end of the school column. Protest was of little use, since by a typical piece of baffling wartime bureaucracy, even to know where the school was headed was some sort of offence against security. A compromise was eventually negotiated, and the Taunton train made an unscheduled stop at Savenake, where the school arrived 2 hours earlier than it would have done if the right train had shown up. The new confusion of war continued when the local evacuation authorities found they had on their hands not only a whole school, 2 hours early, but a trainload of mothers and babies instead of the primary school children they had been expecting. An unplanned-for wave of soldiers also needing billets soon followed. Kingsley slept for the first few days in an army-type bed in a barn, living mostly on tins of condensed milk, issued as part of the school's iron rations. For several days, stragglers continued to arrive, masters and boys, some cycling all the way from London. Soon, Kingsley was allocated with 4 other boys to quarters in a small farm labourer's cottage on the Bath Road, which had been empty for some time. Here Mr. Ellingham and his wife Edna were in charge. Amenities were sparse. The room Kingsley shared with Leonard Richenberg was tiny, perhaps 6 foot by 7, with truckle beds and no electric light, only candles. Baths were taken in the kitchen in a portable tub filled with water from a single cold tap and heated on the stove. There was only an earth closet, which had to be cleared, and Kingsley earned the reputation of being reluctant to do his bit on this and other tasks. He came to suspect that Mr. Ellingham did not greatly care for him, and wondered whether that might not be due, among other causes, to his not having pulled his weight in the cottage. Things got worse as autumn gave way to winter, which that year was freakishly cold. The only fire was in the living room, and Kingsley remembered it as the coldest building he ever lived in, far worse than anything in the army. Conditions one day were such as Richenberg never saw before or afterwards. Trees, he recalls, were coated with ice so that they looked like glacé fruits. Every twig on every tree was encased in its own translucent jacket of ice, sometimes inches thick, and 20-foot boughs came crashing to the ground like matchsticks beneath the weight of accumulated ice. The temperature fell below 20 degrees Fahrenheit, and on at least one night the urine in Richenberg and Kingsley's chamber pot froze. The ground became too slippy to use bicycles, and even walking was dangerous. A master, Mr. J.H. Wheeler, remembered boys arriving at school in the morning looking like bedraggled shire horses, with the feet wrapped in sacking or old socks. Not surprisingly, perhaps, an epidemic of flu broke out, with at one time more than 100 boys laid up in the gymnasium, the college sanatorium being already full up with Marlborough boys. Many years later, Kingsley recalled that winter's day vividly in a poem in which he wrote that, "Walking to school, I saw that every twig, every leaf in the vicar's privet hedge, and every stalk and stem was covered in a thin layer of ice as clear as glass, because the rain had frozen as it landed. The sun shone, and the trees and shrubs shone back like pale flames with orange and green sparkles. Freak weather conditions, people said." Conditions were not improved, in Amos's view, by the outrageously standoffish attitude of Marlborough College. Contact between the two schools was not simple, since timetables had to be organized so that when one school was at, say, lunch, the other was very much not. Without such box and cox arrangements, as Mr. Dale described them, coexistence would have been impossible. Still, there was plenty of time for what Kingsley calls host-like gestures. None was made. The school captains discussed rules and the like. Some of the younger City of London schoolboys were loaned to the Marlborough choir to dilute its baritone strength with their treble voices, and a handful of sportsmen clashed on the squash courts and elsewhere. Otherwise, there was scarcely any contact at all. During his 5 terms at Marlborough, Kingsley reckons to have spent no more than 2 minutes in conversation with Marlborough boys, a fact that more than 50 years later he still finds disgraceful. The atmosphere of the school changed too, with the shift from day school to boarding. In London, CLS boys went home at night, and became the responsibility of their parents. In Marlborough, the school was responsible for them 24 hours a day. But no institutionalized system of discipline existed, and the masters were not accustomed to exercise the kind of authority necessary to keep several hundred boys out of mischief round the clock. Away from parental authority, too, some of the boys ran wild. There was fighting with catapults and air guns, Richenberg recalls. One boy nearly lost an eye and came close even to being killed. Local shopkeepers suspected them of shoplifting. Much of the job of sorting this out fell on the prefects, of whom Kingsley became one, while his roommate Richenberg was made captain of the school. Richenberg remembers this duty taking up much of his time, and finding that first year in Marlborough very distasteful. There were signs, too, that CLS boys might acquire some of the homosexual tendencies which were endemic in boys' boarding schools, much less intense in day schools. But this mostly amounted to little more than some silly talk among the older boys who had developed, or thought they had, a fancy for one or another of the better-looking younger ones. Compulsory games were introduced, perhaps as a means of keeping CLS boys' minds off such dubious distractions, certainly as an extra form of discipline. In London, Kingsley had mostly avoided games, in spite of being harangued by Mr. Copping, his junior housemaster. He pleaded that games would interrupt his studies, and besides, the route between the school sports ground and his home was a horrible dog-leg train journey, an excuse that did not carry much weight with Mr. Ellingham. Now that Kingsley had no choice, he found he enjoyed sport after all. He turned out for Hale House at cricket, rugger, tennis and athletics. He also found a place in the school's second 15 and was even promoted for 3 matches. Not enough to secure his school colours, as it happened, since one match was for the A-team, not the first, and so did not count. All in all, though, his time at Marlborough must be counted the most physically energetic of Kingsley's life, an outburst of regular sporting activity never to be voluntarily repeated in any form of exercise much more demanding than a stroll to the pub. By leaving London, Kingsley lost the small excitements of a great city, like eating lunch in the Lion's Tea Shop near Blackfriars Bridge, or scouring the second-hand bookshops and record stores around the Charing Cross Road with his friend Cyril Metlis. But there were advantages to exile. One was the pleasure of the Wiltshire countryside, which gave a kind of zest to Kingsley's adolescent melancholy. For years afterwards, whenever he tried to visualize a generic country scene, it was always some image of Marlborough that appeared to his mind. He joined the chapel choir, and found that singing in 4-part harmony was the apex of non-sensual pleasures, though listening to a choir he was not part of, he later discovered offended him, sonic wool roughened with sibilance. He took part in further non-political debates, once winning a competition against 16 rivals by defeating a motion that half a loaf is better than none. This he did with schoolboy ingenuity by redefining loaf in the Cockney sense to mean brain, and arguing the dangers of a half-developed intellect. In the Dramatic Society he read the part of the conjurer in Chesterton's play Magic, thoughtfully, but without any really bitter feeling. He claimed that he understood Auden and Isherwood's play The Ascent of F6, even if nobody else did, and explained that the main theme was the demon mother, who, too ambitious for her son, led him on to final destruction. He read the part of M.F., and succeeded in conveying his doubt in the whole journey. Kingsley became secretary of the Music Society, too. He would give a short lecture at its meetings, then play records of a symphony. One boy, Len Dowsett, owed a lifelong interest in classical music to being introduced to it by Kingsley. All boys had to join the Officers' Training Corps at the age of 14, unless they claimed to be pacifists or conscientious objectors, in which case they joined the Boy Scouts and were mildly despised by their fellows. Boys put on uniforms like those of the Rifle Brigade twice a week. As cadets, they drilled, did weapons training, went on field days, and spent an annual 2 weeks in summer camp. They learned to shoot, and Kingsley became a first-class shot and a sergeant. While the school was still in London, he was drilled at Wellington Barracks, and was once one of the school contingent in the annual Lord Mayor's show. A boy called Moss discovered a bookshop near the Temple which sold War Office publications, including a book about section leadership in the cavalry. Kingsley joined the Corps' mounted section and took riding lessons every week from a Colonel Lawrence. He hated being on a horse when it cantered, but liked wearing breeches instead of trousers, and tying his puttees in a way that marked him off from his schoolmates. Like others of his age, Kingsley was brought up on legends of soldierly heroism. Storytellers like Rudyard Kipling, G.A. Henty, John Buchan, Anthony Hope, and Percy F. Westerman described the adventures of brave soldiers or civilians with service life not far away in their backgrounds. Many such tales were about the First World War. One, called The Dispatch Riders, had 2 English schoolboys joining the Belgian army and driving off a German patrol with soda siphons. This appealed to Kingsley not only for its bravery, but because, as an only child, being a soldier implied membership of an organization in which imaginary comrades were shadow brothers. He developed a taste, too, for poems with military themes, by writers like Macaulay, Southey, Browning, Kipling, and Houseman, some of which he was to include in his 1978 collection of stirringly declaimable verse, The Faber Popular Reciter. The army was to hold a long fascination for Kingsley. For a while he even thought he might become a soldier if he did not become a writer. Romantic enthusiasm for the military life was, however, tempered by caution and a couple of dashes of cowardice and laziness. At Marlborough, Kingsley found a new niche in the signals group, which was given instruction in Morse code and signalling by flag. Its advantages included not having to wear uniform or do foot drill, and to prepare him to join the Royal Corps of Signals when he reached the army proper. In spite of its drawbacks and inconveniences, Kingsley found his terms at Marlborough more liberating than otherwise. There were no parents to boss him around, and he had time to cultivate his relations with boys who in London might go home after school to the other side of town. Friendships flourished with Richenberg, Metlis, and Saul Rose, another resident of the Bath Road cottage. Early on in his career at the City of London School, Kingsley had learned that neither class nor race, intellect nor prowess at sport were the keys to schoolboy popularity. To be accepted, you had only to be amiable. To be liked, you needed preeminently to be able to raise the occasional laugh, for which no great resources of wit were necessary. One particularly effective way of doing this was to be able to mimic members of the staff. Kingsley, already adept at mimicry from experience at home, developed his version of Mr. Dale. Get it right, not wrong. Black, not white. Cat, not dog. This sort of thing, he found, easily earned him the esteem of his classmates. Like most, perhaps all schoolchildren, Kingsley saw his teachers not so much as real people, but as caricatures, whose eccentricities stayed in the memory for life. He was ever afterwards able to remember Mr. Marsh sucking the earpiece of his glasses, Mr. Penn accusing us all of having eaten his biscuits, Mr. Carruthers remaining imperturbable when Kingsley and another boy, Rumsey, deliberately dropped a suitcase full of broken glass on the floor to make an ear-shattering crash, and Mr. Copping, who spoke with an Attic Greek accent of the 5th century. Masters make this indelible impression on boys in their early teens because schoolboys see the adult world, according to Kingsley, with the delighted, faintly hostile astonishment of the tourist. The schoolboy is entertained to the limits of endurance by its quaint tribal customs, its grotesque ritual dances, its capering, scowling, gesticulating witch doctors. For most boys, this way of seeing the world passes when he enters the adult world himself. But the novelist must retain something of the adolescent's coldly wondering stare, or so Kingsley came to believe. In his observations of his schoolmasters, he can perhaps be seen unconsciously rehearsing his novelist's gift for appropriating useful parts of the characters around him. If his masters were making a lasting impression on Kingsley, he was making the same on his schoolboy contemporaries. He had a knack for getting on with people, for making friends. There was a great affinity between us, Richenberg remembers. We were on the same wavelength. Cyril Metlis says, it was an intense period, we sparked off each other. According to Sir, as he later became Peter Baldwin, he was a really good friend, very kind. He had an acerbic tongue, but about things rather than people. Besides his private friendships, Amis had public dash. He was bright, gregarious, good fun, a great maker of faces and pricker of pomposity. In the judgment of Sir, as he also became, George Blunden, Kingsley, in his last year, was clearly the intellectual leader of the school. Metliss remembers him at this time as a great comic and full of fun. To Baldwin, irreverence was a very great factor of his character. His charm helped him get away with things. We expected him to be different, an iconoclastic chap. He was great fun in class, more of an undergraduate than a schoolboy. Richenberg says, the pastiches he did of French, German, and Russian generals were childish but very funny. Blunden recalls that in his last year Kingsley set the standards of cultural and intellectual activity out of class. He revelled in being the intellectual star. When his first novel, Lucky Jim, was published 13 years after he left school, those same people, and others who knew him in youth, were quick to identify the Kingsley they had known with the Jim Dixon of his novel. In that last year, Blunden recalls, he turned into Lucky Jim. When I first read Lucky Jim, says Richenberg, I thought that's Kingsley. When he read Lucky Jim, Dowsett recalls, I thought that was Kingsley at school. Lucky Jim, says Metliss simply, was Kingsley. Such straightforward identifications between Jim and himself, or indeed between any of his fictional characters and any real person, were to infuriate Kingsley for the rest of his life. Just because Jim drank rather a lot, for instance, why should it be assumed that his creator did too? But people do make such identifications between writer and character, and whether rightly or wrongly, the unanimous verdict of his contemporaries was that Amos at 18 already bore a striking likeness to the Lucky Jim he had not yet even begun to think of. For Kingsley to go on to university, a further scholarship was required, William being in no better position to pay for Oxford or Cambridge than he was for the City of London School. There were plenty of scholarships in classics to be had at both universities, and Kingsley believed himself good enough to walk into one of those if he had wanted. But in his last school years he was already thinking of becoming a writer, and so set his sights on reading English instead. This created two problems. There was no precedent at CLS, and so no provision for teaching English to the necessary level, and there were far fewer scholarships in this discipline. So far as Kingsley knew, only 2 each at Oxford and Cambridge. The school rallied round to accommodate him with the extra lessons he needed. Thus, brought up to the mark, Kingsley tried for a scholarship at St. Catherine's College, Cambridge, and failed. He then tried for an exhibition at St. John's College, Oxford, and succeeded. Kingsley was to be always grateful to CLS for the special efforts it made to get him up to standard. Indeed, he was to remain grateful for the whole 7 years he spent at the school. If not the happiest years of his life, they were certainly as good as he could have hoped for. In 1958 he paid his old school a golden tribute, writing, I have never in my life known a community where factions of any kind were less in evidence, where differences of class, upbringing, income group, and religion counted for so little. In particular, although perhaps 15% of the boys were Jewish, not a single instance of even the mildest anti-Semitism, apart from the incident involving the regimental sergeant major and Richenberg, came to my attention in the 7 years I was a pupil there. The academic teaching was of a standard not easily to be surpassed, but more important still was that lesson about how to regard one's fellows, a lesson not delivered but enacted. Thanks indeed for that. During Kingsley's last summer holiday from school in 1940, the Amis family suddenly quit Norbury for good. Peggy became frightened at the closeness of the German bomber flight path overhead, though Norbury was to escape largely unharmed, only some 14 bombs falling on it throughout the war, and the family headed north for the commutable town of Berkhamsted in Hertfordshire, beyond the bombers' usual targets. They stayed for a while at the flat of William's secretary, Miss Woolcock, Woolley, until one house was found, a sort of workman's cottage, as Kingsley remembers it, and then another in Shrublands Avenue, which was to become the final Amis family home. The move made Kingsley a bit lonely, isolated. Going to school in central London, and later at Marlborough, on top of his parents' ruthless exclusion policy towards potential chums, had kept him short of friends out of school hours. But against the odds he had succeeded in making a few in Norbury, and now he was cut off from them again. Oxford offered rich potential for making up this deficiency, for ending what he thought of as the underpopulation of his childhood and youth. One consequence of this was to make it difficult for him to judge his own early years, whether or not they might have been better or happier. Having no brother or sister, living a circumscribed suburban existence, he had few standards by which to measure other young lives against his own. When he looks back, his judgment is ambiguous. A cousin, say, who happened in on his home, might think he had never seen a worse case of a poor lad being terrorized, or equally that his parents were a model of compassion and tenderness. Both views could be valid, depending on the temper of the moment the cousin chose to visit. In retrospect, though, Kingsley felt no reason to complain, no grounds for believing that his relations with his parents were better or worse than anybody else's. Paradoxically, the years of maximum conflict between father and son had also been the years of greatest intimacy. Kingsley and William were never so close as when they were at each other's throats, though perhaps this is not as much of a contradiction as it seems. The closeness weakened when Kingsley began to live away from home, first at Marlborough, then at Oxford, and in the army. As their lives grew apart, Kingsley's relation with his father changed from conflict to indifference to boredom. Until he married in 1948, the chief magnetic influence that continued to draw him home was lack of money with which to stay away. When his parents visited him after his marriage, the time dragged. William and Peggy never gave up their habit of trying to do everything together as a family. Instead of meeting at mealtimes, say, and going their own way for the rest of the day, they had to be around all the time. Observing this, Kingsley's friend Philip Larkin commiserated with him, "Your parents never leave you alone." When Peggy died of a stroke in 1957, Kingsley brought his father to stay with him in Swansea, and took him along for his sabbatical year in America in 1958-9. William enjoyed America, but found it difficult to fill up his days in Swansea, and returned to London, finding a new job with a company which dealt in domestic cleaning materials. There he perked up enough from his desolation at Peggy's death to have a couple of lady friends, about whom he was unusually forthcoming to his son, though still diffident, as always in matters of sex. William died of cancer on the 18th of April 1963, leaving such possessions as he had to one of his ladies, who insisted on reclaiming even the watch and wallet that had been passed on to Kingsley's sons, Philip and Martin. The only memento of his father Kingsley had left to keep was his last letter, thanking his son for getting him into a nursing home at Cambridge, where Kingsley was then teaching. Kingsley had nothing of his mother's. After his parents' deaths, Kingsley's feelings changed to regret. Of his mother he wrote in his memoirs that she was the first of the appallingly long line of figures in my life whom I have come to value altogether more highly, to appreciate the uniqueness of, now they are gone. To his father's memory he wrote a poem, In Memoriam W.R.A., in which he asked William to forgive him that it should have taken so long for his pride and love to become clear, and to arouse Kingsley's love in return. I'm sorry you had to die to make me sorry you're not here now. It is possible to see Kingsley's adult life, from Oxford onwards, as a kind of gigantic spree, in perpetual celebration of his good luck in escaping the restrictions of his family home, but heavily modified by an equally endless attempt to live up to his father's expectations, or at least not let him down too badly. There is a Kingsley Amis who wants nothing more than to have a good time, and another Kingsley Amis who, with his father's ghost at his shoulder, desperately wants to achieve. This may be fanciful, no more than a piece of suggestive imagery. What is certain is that Kingsley left home for Oxford already firmly moulded. He had developed a large appetite for sociability and for sex. The first not adequately satisfied, the second not satisfied at all. He had learned to work hard. His interest in literature and other forms, major and minor, from music to films, had been intensely aroused. He had formed the intention of being a writer, even if that was more a vague ambition to be something than a concrete plan actually to write something. His skills as a mimic, face-puller, and entertainer of his chums, all to be important in his writing and his social life, were well advanced. He was a committed non-Christian who was nevertheless attracted to and influenced by the beliefs he did not hold. He was also a communist, though that turned out to be a phase, unlike his lifelong non-Christianity. The young Kingsley had also formed habits that the mature Amis kept up all his life. For example, dislike of the telephone, of being bored, of domestic chores, of looking after himself in practical ways, whether cooking, shopping, or keeping his accounts. Even at Oxford, William continued to look after his son's finances, paying his bills out of his exhibition, and allotting Kingsley 10 shillings, 50p a week pocket money. Kingsley's darker side, his anxieties and phobias, fear of flying, of being alone, of being trapped in an enclosed space or in the dark, were in place too. Apart from sex, almost the only thing he had yet to be properly introduced to was drink. Oxford got him started on both. 4. Wartime Oxford. Amos went up to Oxford for the first time in April 1941, arriving from Berkhamsted in the family butcher's old Morris car, in what he called in his memoirs impeccably proletarian style. In normal times, he would have started with all the new undergraduates of his year in the autumn term, but this was wartime, and now undergraduates arrived from school and departed for the forces in every one of the academic year's 3 terms. War had changed the whole mood and tone of the university, as it had the rest of the country. The Oxford of aesthete, aristocrat, and wealthy playboy, of Max Beerbohm's Zuleika Dobson or Evelyn Waugh's Brideshead Revisited, had all but vanished. A young man with money was at no great advantage over others without, since the mobilization of the nation's resources for the war effort saw to it that there were few luxuries left for anybody to spend money on. Nighttime blackout was only the most obvious expression of the drab and sombre mood that settled over Oxford while the war lasted. Life in college was austere, Philip Larkin, who was Amos's contemporary at St. John's, remembered. Everyone paid the same fees, in our case 12 shillings a day, and ate the same meals. Because of Ministry of Food regulations, the town could offer little in the way of luxurious eating and drinking, and college festivities, such as commemoration balls, had to be suspended for the duration. Because of petrol rationing, nobody ran a car. Because of clothes rationing, it was difficult to dress stylishly. There was still coal in the bunkers outside our rooms, but fuel rationing was soon to remove it. It became a routine after ordering one's books in the Bodleian Library after breakfast to go and look for a cake or cigarette queue. To this list of deprivations, Amos's memory adds that there were no lunch parties. Food was rationed, liquor was hard to get, beer was short, everything was cut back. Everybody was spending hours in trains waiting for things to happen, or hours queuing for food. Not essential food, but for any luxury. There was enforced pub crawling, because one pub would sell beer early in the evening and another later on, so there would be groups of us just drifting around. Pubs were supposed to be out of bounds to undergraduates, but in this respect at least war made no difference to their habit of defying the authorities by ignoring the ban. There were other abnormalities in the pattern of Oxford life. Younger dons were subject to war service, like everybody else, and were drafted into the forces or the newly inflated Whitehall bureaucracies, leaving behind dons who were elderly and somewhat remote, partly at least because of the administrative burden created by the ceaseless turnover of undergraduates. St. John's did its bit for the war effort by housing sections of the Ministry of Agriculture, which dealt with white fish and potatoes, so earning the college the temporary nickname Fish and Chips. Consequent shortage of space meant that undergraduates often had to double up in rooms normally occupied by a single man. There were then, of course, no women at any of the Oxford colleges, other than those set up especially for them, although Amos was allocated a nasty little pair of rooms in the top corner of the front quad to himself. Only those undergraduates studying subjects with some useful connection to the war effort, such as medicine or science, were allowed to stay the full length of their courses. The rest could expect no more than a few terms before being called up, leaving their studies to be completed later if they survived the war to return. Amos managed to secure the maximum grace of 4 terms by taking advantage of a regulation that gave extra time to those who said they were willing to become schoolmasters after they graduated, and he turned up at the Vice-Chancellor's office to promise faithfully he would do so. Amos's promise may have been made on tactical grounds, but it was not wholly insincere. A schoolmaster was what Amos then thought he would probably become on his way to becoming a writer. In the meantime, though, he was obliged to put on a uniform and turn out a day and a half each week for the senior training corps. He was reluctant, but knew that compliance meant a shorter spell in the ranks and a smooth path to officer status when he finally joined the army, while refusal would have earned him an instant call-up as a private soldier with no certainty of becoming an officer at all. Corps service involved weapons training and map reading, but mainly meant drilling, which was economical of space, equipment, instructors, and preparation, and at which Amos, with the experience of the school corps behind him, found himself to be quite good. Amos did signals training too. Once he was faced with the certainty that he would have to join the army during a real war with real guns firing, the military life no longer seemed quite so romantically appealing. The choice, as he saw it, was between signing up with either the Ploftzian Lancers or the 2nd Royal Fusiliers Depot Regiment, or between heroism and safety. Now that the moment of decision approached at full speed, Amos was in no doubt. Friends who had been declared unfit for call-up seemed likely to survive. Amos was bloody well determined he would not let his good health prevent him doing the same. One friend, with similar life-saving intentions, Norman Manning, recommended the signals section as a step on the way to the Royal Corps of Signals when the time came. "We're always in the back," Manning told him. "We don't go further forward than brigade." Amos saw the sense in that and joined up. The signals were to serve him well as a vehicle of survival, but the unfortunate Manning succumbed to tropical disease within weeks of being sent to India. Besides military training, there was another wartime chore: fire-watching. Hitler had threatened to unleash Baedeker guidebook raids on England, which would ravish the country's historic towns as well as the usual military-industrial targets, and Oxford was considered a likely stop on the bombers' tourist route. There were stirrup pumps and ladders all over St. John's, and fire-watching was done in 2-hour shifts throughout the night, undergraduates taking their turn every 10 days or so. The atmosphere created by the war may have robbed Oxford of most of its glamour, but there were balancing compensations in the new regime of austerity. Traditional class distinctions were compressed, if not entirely eliminated. Sergeant Major Reed of the Scots Guards, reputed to have killed 15 Germans with his bayonet at Dunkirk, bawled with equal ferocity at common folk like Amos, and at Lord this of Magdalen or the Honourable that of Christchurch. "You're the worst bloody soldier I've ever seen, sir. Now get down to the hut and back at the double." There was for Amos a wealth of satisfaction in hearing upper-class undergraduates berated in such language. War was the overwhelming reality of those first 4 terms, but it was also curiously distant. It was something you read of in the papers and heard on the wireless, according to one of Amos's contemporaries at St. John's, Nick Russell. About as actual as newsreel pictures. Nor, contrary to abiding myths of a nation united in patriotic fervour, was there in Amos's recollection any great enthusiasm for actually joining up and fighting, at any rate among undergraduates. He and his contemporaries would have preferred to ignore the war altogether if they possibly could, in the hope, perhaps, that it would go away if they did. Philip Larkin wrote in November 1941 to a friend that, "I just don't want to go into the army. I want to pretend it isn't there, that there's no war on." Elsewhere he wrote, "I was fundamentally, like the rest of my friends, uninterested in the war." Larkin managed to avoid service himself by being declared medically unfit because of his poor eyesight, as did others of Amos's undergraduate friends like Bruce Montgomery and John Wayne, thereby incidentally increasing Amos's sense of grievance about the whole thing, and also, incidentally, helping to resolve in his mind a familiar question: why did the Second World War produce so few good poets compared to the First? Answer: because so many who might have been good war poets avoided being called up. Nevertheless, the war, however distant or unwelcome, permeated everything, and one of its now forgotten effects was to stop people thinking about the future, because there could be no certainty of having one. To Oxford undergraduates, this meant not worrying about their careers at the university or after it. Even more than class distinctions, careerism disappeared for the duration. Set beside the possibility of getting killed, such ambitions as becoming a Rugger Blue, or an officer at the Oxford Union, or a star of the social scene were bound to seem frivolous and unimportant, while fretting over the relative merits of the law, the civil service, or teaching as career choices were utterly pointless. All this went into what Larkin called the distinctive quality of Oxford at that time. A lack of douceur was balanced by a lack of bêtise, he wrote, whether of college ceremonial or undergraduate extravagance. I think our perspectives were truer as a result. At an age when self-importance would have been normal, events cut us ruthlessly down to size. When he first arrived, Amos's only friends in Oxford were fewer than a dozen former schoolmates from CLS, all of them at other colleges. They threw a party for him at Balliol, at which he got seriously drunk for the first time in his life, on half a bottle of sherry. Having staggered back the short distance to his own college and settled himself in an armchair with a chamber pot on his lap, his sufferings were interrupted by two representatives of the University Conservative Association hoping to recruit him, but on seeing his plight they politely withdrew, offering to come back at a more convenient time. There did, however, turn out to be one young man in St. John's whom Amos had met before. While in search of a scholarship at Cambridge, he had shared digs with a Bristol schoolboy, Norman Isles, who was also in search of a scholarship, also failed to get one from St. Catherine's, Cambridge, and also turned up at St. John's, reaching it in fact ahead of Amos, and becoming Philip Larkin's partner in tutorials. It was through Isles that Amos met Larkin, and so began the most important friendship of his life. In Larkin's recollection, Isles spotted Amos's name in a list of new arrivals on the notice board in the college lodge, and immediately recommended him as a hell of a good man, because he shoots guns. The significance of this odd talent puzzled Larkin until, later the same afternoon, Amos appeared in the front quadrangle, as he and Isles were crossing it. Without a word, Isles raised and pointed his right hand and fired an imaginary pistol shot at Amos. The young man's reaction was immediate, Larkin wrote years later. Clutching his chest in a rictus of agony, he threw one arm up against the archway and began slowly crumpling downwards, fingers scoring the stonework. Just as he was about to collapse, however, he righted himself and trotted over to us. Introductions were made, and Amos treated the two to variations to the pistol routine on which he had been working. A pistol fired in a ravine, then the same thing again, but with ricochet noises added. Isles laughed while Larkin stood silent. For the first time, he recalled, I felt myself in the presence of a talent greater than my own. Amos has no memory of this incident at all, though there is no reason to believe it is untrue on that account. His own first memory of Larkin has a warmth of a different sort. Larkin generously, if uncharacteristically, offered him a cigarette, the equivalent in those days of a glass of rare malt whisky. Isles was for a while the centre of a circle that included Amos and Larkin, who were drawn to him by the force of his eccentricities, if not much else. Amos describes him as large-faced, out of condition, with an air of half-serious hostility to the world in general, to any received idea, but unaffectionate tolerance towards individuals of his own standing. It was hard, Amos thought, to say what Isles believed he was doing at Oxford at all, since he did what he could to undermine the academic outlook by representing the university as a place where charlatans lorded it over ambitious or apathetic noodles. Larkin confirms this version of Isles as square peg in round hole. Isles would roar like the Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer lion at anything which implied respect for qualities such as punctuality, prudence, thrift, or respectability. Ostentatious courtesy produced a falsetto, celestial choir effect. Ostentatious sensibility, the recommendation to write a poem about it. But Isles treated everyone equally in the same uncharitable way, and had the further saving grace of keeping his most hilarious mockeries for himself. His total rejection of the Oxford environment, Larkin thought, at first increased his influence over his friends, but later tended to cut him off from them. Much to Amos's surprise, Isles passed both his exams and his certificate for officer training, though he was later sent to an outfit for unemployable officers, and at the end of the war became part of a Friends Relief Unit in Poland, where at last, according to Larkin, he seemed to be doing what he wanted. With Isles and Larkin, Amos was drawn into a loose group of St. John's men who called themselves the Seven. Other members were Jimmy Wilcox, Philip Brown, Nick Russell, and David Williams. It began with one formal meeting, but quickly turned into something more convivial, supper parties once a week, or simply drinking beer in someone's rooms. Now and then the Seven would become serious enough to pass a poem around, and they held at least some ideas or attitudes in common. Literature was to be taken seriously, though it was not to detach them from drinking and swearing. Dons were not to be respected, but not challenged either. They were to be different from their parents' generation, but that did not mean abandoning all traditions. Such attitudes were congenial to Amos then and for the rest of his life, but the Seven did not constitute anything so coherent or purposeful as a literary movement, more a source of annoyance to the college for their rowdy behaviour, playing records too loudly and the like. Much of what they got up to was simply childish. Larkin and Amos were not above pissing in the common room fire after an evening on the beer. At various times they were summoned by the college dean to account for offences like these, an experience retold in Larkin's poem Dockery and Son, which recalls how, black-gowned, unbreakfasted, and still half-tight, we used to stand before that desk to give our version of these incidents last night. Amos became best known at Oxford for, in Larkin's words, his genius for imaginative mimicry. Over the years, Amos was to develop a whole repertoire of set pieces. There was President Roosevelt, broadcasting across the Atlantic through crackling airwaves, a Japanese soldier mutilating a corpse, which started with Amos's head appearing from behind a sofa, a bomb exploding among a crowd of hearties drinking at a table, with what one witness called a wonderfully prolonged detonation, a variety of scenes from gangster movies with parts improbably assigned to well-known Oxford literary figures like Lord David Cecil, the gang leader, and C.S. Lewis, the squealer. His masterpiece, according to Larkin, involved 3 subalterns, a Glaswegian driver, and a jeep breaking down and refusing to restart somewhere in Germany. This one was so demanding that Larkin only heard Amos do it twice. So realistic were Amos's impressions that once, beaming his motorbike failing to start noise in the direction of a motorcyclist who had just got off his machine, he caused the man to return to it, puzzled at why it was trying to restart its engine without him. John Wayne called him the best raconteur in Oxford. I've seen him surrounded by people begging him to stop, tears of laughter choking from all his funny stories. At the beginning, though, Larkin found Amos's wit to be not so much a matter of set pieces like these as the quickest way of convincing you that something was horrible or boring or absurd. The local comrade, Isa poincha si, asa poincha si. The Irish tenor, the sun was declining. The University Company Sergeant Major, go on, sir. Amos naturally enjoyed being admired for his wit and his mimicry, but celebrity in this department had its drawbacks. It stopped people taking seriously his serious side, which in his first terms at Oxford primarily meant politics. As Larkin put it, in his efforts to prove he had a serious side, he became insulting in his emphasis, which made him disliked by many who could not appreciate the humour that he breathed like air. In the long run, however, it may have been just as well that Amos's humour was better remembered than his politics. The reputation of having once been a whole-hearted communist is hardly one that Amos would have welcomed, snapping at his heels for the rest of his days, as it did other undergraduates of the period such as Denis Healey, later Labour Chancellor. But a communist is what Amos was, and although some people thought this was just another of the faces he showed the world, he was wholly sincere about it. Being a communist put him at the far end of the prevailing spectrum of Oxford politics, which was heavily tilted to the left, influenced by the slump of the 1930s and the rise of Nazism, especially as these were interpreted to intelligent young people by the Left Book Club. As often, the political left was divided. In 1940, the Oxford Labour Club had split in 2, one faction towing the Communist Party line, then determined by the anti-Soviet pact, which meant being against Finnish resistance to the Soviet Union and the war in the West. The non-communist faction was in favour of both. Roy Jenkins and Tony Crossland, both later prominent members of Labour governments, founded and led the breakaway anti-communist Democratic Socialist Club. Others, like the novelist Iris Murdoch and the military historian John Terraine, went with the communists. As treasurers of the rival factions, Jenkins and Murdoch had to negotiate the division of the Labour Club's assets, he addressing her in proper bourgeois fashion, "Dear Miss Murdoch," she responding with communist correctness, "Dear Comrade Jenkins." George Blunden, an old friend from CLS and by then an undergraduate at University College, remembers Amos calling round to ask him along to a communist meeting, which Amos wanted to attend, but not by himself. They went to 3 meetings in all. Blunden found them full of boring people who talked in an extraordinary jargon, and he did not join up. But Amos did. He went to meetings of the Berkhamsted branch of the party during vacations too. Amos tried to recruit other members of St. John's to the cause, and he also attended meetings of the People's Convention, a peace campaign with strong communist links. He read Marx, Lenin, and Plekhanov, went to communist study groups and meetings, sometimes speaking himself, sang in the Labour Club choir, and edited the club's bulletin for a term in 1942. Amis was an open member of the party, meaning that if he got up to speak at a meeting, he was free to begin, "As a communist, I want to say this." There were closed members, too, people who did not reveal their party affiliation. At one time it was rumoured 3 out of 5 members of the committee that ran the Oxford Conservative Party were actually such closet communists, though this may have been no more than a piece of self-serving communist disinformation. The unquenchable assiduity with which the party carried out such penetration exercises into even non-political organisations like churches was the one useful lesson Amis believed he learned from his brief membership. Edward Ducan, a contemporary at St. John's and later a Tory cabinet minister, remembers thinking that Amis had political steel in him,